Whether it's an alternate reality, distinct publishing line, or relaunch, the Man of Steel continues to be reconceived from his origin to his final fate. Over this 4-part event, we will journey from the Dark Knight universe to Earth 1, from the New 52 continuity to the Elseworld of Red Sun, as we explore whether the core of the character endures. This is Superman Reimagined. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I am your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss Superman Earth 1, the trilogy of original graphic novels written by J. Michael Straczynski, is the publisher of the real-life Daily Planet. Yes, you heard that right. The real-life Daily Planet, Zack Benz. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. That's I never get used to that introduction. I've been introduced like that on Zack's Always Hold On to Smallville, and I forget how the Daily Planet has kind of evolved since I started it on Twitter. So I really appreciate that.
We appreciate you bringing this into the world. So let's explain what the Daily Planet is, because it's not a Superman fan site. Nothing wrong with it if it were, but you've built this into a legitimate news organization. How did this get started?
So it actually started in 2014 on Twitter. I started the Daily Planet DC, and I would do online editions, and it was actually meant to be a fan site, but more and more people wanted to contribute work that was important to them, and so it evolved into an actual news publication that is contributor based. While recognizing our roots that it is inspired by the Daily Planet from Superman comics, we report on basically everything that happens on the planet, and I try not to turn people away. It's a site for the people by the people, as my friend Brianna likes to say. And I'm hoping to turn it into an actual legitimate news publication. Yeah.
That's terrific. And I've mentioned it on the show before, but it's great to have you here. And for anyone who hasn't checked out dailyplanetdc.com, please do follow along on social media. I know Twitter is probably where you're the most active, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to vamp up Instagram and Facebook, but there's a better audience, and I think a stronger community for especially in the comic book community on Twitter.
This is true. I mean, I will say from my own experience as a Superman podcaster, I mean, I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Instagram is solid, I will say, but I do get more engagement and more traction on Twitter. That's the sense that I've gotten. And
yeah.
The Facebook page is very limited. I could go on a whole rant about Facebook and organic reach and paid ads and all that stuff. I do have the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network Facebook group, which everyone is welcome to join. That's at least a better way to actually connect with people and get a response. But generally, Facebook leaves a bit to be desired, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah. I like to say Facebook is for family and Instagram is for sharing photos, and then Twitter is for sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on for this episode is that the Earth 1 graphic novels, they do spend a good amount of time at the Daily Planet with Perry and Lois and Jimmy and Clark. Mm-hmm. And the writer of these books, J. Michael Straczynski, also has a background as a journalist. So given Straczynski's background, what's covered in the books, and your own experience, and mine as well as a journalism major in undergrad, I thought that would lend itself well to a discussion here.
Yeah, I actually did not know you were a journalism major. That's some cool information.
Well, at Fordham now they have an actual dedicated proper journalism major. When I did it, I was technically a communications and media studies major with a specialization in journalism.
Yeah.
So whatever. Not that I'm sore about that. Nothing wrong with being a communications major, but I would have preferred had it been journalism the way it is now. But I took all the journalism classes that I could, and I loved it. And I think that definitely helped pave the way for the documentary and podcast work that I've done now, and even the article that I wrote that I had the opportunity to write for Daily Planet DC.
Yeah, it explains why that was such stellar work now. Thanks.
I appreciate that. I'll give a tip of the hat to, I had a couple of professors at Fordham in particular, like who really like took an interest. And I wrote about comics and the comic shop that I worked at in a lot of the pieces that I did. And it was, to this day, those were the classes, when I look at all of my schooling, including law school, especially law school, those undergrad journalism classes were the ones that I enjoyed the most. So they'll always have a special place for me.
Yeah. I actually, similarly, I went to UMD, University of Minnesota Duluth, and worked at a comic book shop while I majored in journalism also. And I wrote about, well, that's where I started the Daily Planet. So yeah.
Very, very nice. And what about your Superman fan journey, right? We always call it, it's the Superman fan journey. Where does your Superman fan journey start? And I guess, like, what are some of the big tent poles? Like I always talk about that, the Superman and Smallville. What are the big tent poles of your fandom?
Okay, well, I'll start with my fan journey, and it actually starts in a very interesting place. That's the earliest memory I can think of discovering superheroes, and that was watching Scooby-Doo. And it was the old Scooby-Doo movies, and it was one where Batman and Scooby-Doo crossed over, and I was like, oh, this Batman guy is kind of cool. I'm going to go look into him. And I found it a really old World's Finest comic that was so beaten up, it missed most of the story. And it was the one where Superman pretended to be Batman, so people would stop assuming Batman was Bruce Wayne, or vice versa for Clark Kent. I don't remember, but it was super old. And I actually fell in love with Lois Lane there, and Superman and their dynamic, and Lois's sass. And so then I started doing research, and I discovered Smallville. And Smallville, around that time, I think it was in season 4, and I was watching the reruns on ABC Family, and that's my major tentpole right there, is Smallville. And then other tentpoles would probably include the animated series, Justice League Unlimited, and Superman the Animated Series, and I'm sure there's a third one. It's not Death of Superman. Let me look at my comics quick so I can refresh my memory. It's For Tomorrow, Superman for Tomorrow.
Oh, it's funny, man. We're on the same wavelength, because we must have spoken about that when I covered it. And that's why I was going to jump to that. Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah. And so what, if any, role did these Earth One graphic novels play? Because I know when I reached out to you about doing this, you're like, I really enjoyed those. So I guess, what sort of impact did that have on you as a Superman fan when those books came out? And they were published in 2010, 2012, and 2015.
Yeah. When the first one came out, I was in 10th grade in high school. And, around that time, you're contemplating, what am I going to do for the rest of my life? Where am I going to move? What am I going to do for college? And I was revolving around journalism as a career. I also wanted to do architecture, but my talents were stronger in journalism. And reading this book and having most of the story, a big chunk of it, take place in the Daily Planet and around journalism, in the world of journalism, it was really fun. A lot of the later seasons of Smallville and the first 4 seasons, or at least the first season, really revolved around journalism. And I just liked how all of Superman's adventures would be immortalized for other people to read. And I wanted to do that for other people. So that's one of the reasons why I really enjoyed this book. The reason I took it off the shelf and paid for it was because of the Daily Planet issue printed in the back that retold Superman's story. And I really enjoyed that tie-in newspaper as well. So
cool. Gotcha. No, that makes a lot of sense. So, I suspect people listening to this are familiar with these Earth One Superman books in particular, and with the Earth One line generally. But the idea was that this would be, from a ground up, continuity free approach to DC's most iconic characters. So, sort of a la Marvel's Ultimate line, but It's definitely aimed more, I think, at the bookstore market, and the fact that they went with original graphic novels, I think, sort of, you know, points a little bit more towards that. They've hit on a number of characters in the decade plus since it started. I actually meant to check this. I don't know that any of the books ever had any tie-ins with each other. I think they, for the most part, all ended up being standalone. Do you know?
The only tie-in I can remember, and this is also why I bought Batman Earth One, but I mainly put all my money and effort towards Superman Earth One. But they had a tie-in in the Daily Planet issue about Batman or the Bat in Gotham City or something. Page whatever. You can't read about it, but it's there, and that's the only tie-in I can remember.
Okay. So yeah, largely standalone, and we ended up with this trilogy, this 3-volume series by J. Michael Straczynski. Now, I want to talk about Straczynski here. In addition to the 3 Earth One books, in anticipation of this episode, I also read his autobiography called Becoming Superman. And it was eye-opening. I'll circle back to that in a second. But generally speaking, my main experience with Straczynski was his Amazing Spider-Man run. That was where I first met him. I had never watched Babylon 5 on television, which I know was his big claim to fame. I've never been a huge like sci-fi guy. In any event, I had missed the boat on that. So I really didn't know him when he took over Amazing Spider-Man, and this was the very early 2000s. Have you read that run?
No.
No. Okay. It's well, that's a whole other episode for another podcast that maybe we'll do at some point.
Yeah.
I'll say this. I enjoyed it more than I didn't. And the beginning part of it was very, very strong. Towards the end, we got into the whole, one more day territory, which is its own can of worms there. But I really did fall in love with his writing on Amazing Spider-Man. And then I went back and I took a look at Rising Stars, which was the 24 issue series at Top Cow that he was doing about these superpowered beings who were navigating the world together. And right before Earth One, he took over the Superman and Wonder Woman monthly titles. On Superman, he launched the Grounded arc. He ended up only actually scripting 4 out of the intended 12 issues, and then he left to focus on Earth One. And I guess, because I remember when the Superman Earth One came out, and I think at that point I had soured on Straczynski a bit. Like I said, loved the beginning of his Spider-Man run, kind of fell out of love with it by the end. And Rising Stars did eventually finish, but it was plagued by delays. It took years to finish those 24 issues. Like I said, he left Wonder Woman and Superman early to focus on Earth One. And I think I just sort of came to view him, fairly or not, as not a finisher, not a closer. That was sort of the view that I had. So I don't know that I necessarily went into Earth One with the highest of hopes. But I did pick it up. It's funny. I dug this out of my archives here. I remember coming across an ad I think it was in a DC comic, or maybe it was even Wizard at the time, going so far back. But there was an ad for Earth One, Volume 1. And this was over a decade ago. I mean, I took a picture of this because I was so offended by this. just to give some insight into my mindset going into Earth One back in the day. The pull quote in this ad, it was a pull quote from The Hollywood Reporter, and it said, "What do you get when you combine Twilight and a classic superhero, the new Superman?" And that... What? True story. I have the photographic evidence right here.
That is a terrible ad.
It is. In fairness, it is. I don't think that accurately represents the Earth One comic. But like I said, that was, I was just going into Earth One, having kind of soured on Straczynski a bit, and seeing press like that. And I was just like, I don't think this is going to be for me. But I'm glad to get that reaction, because I remember seeing that. I'm like, what is this? But again, I think that just spoke to, I guess what DC was trying to do, or what they were trying to attract. I mean, that's what they were putting out there. They were clearly very proud of this, this description.
I mean, Clark's a bit broody, but I wouldn't compare him to like Edward Cullen or something like that. Like, Yeah, it's an inaccurate description.
Yeah. So anyway, then the last piece of this trip down memory lane was I remember this was at the time where I was working at my local comic shop, the late Alternate Realities in New York. And I remember I bought Earth One Volume 1. I went home and I read it. And the next time I came into the store, I remember I was talking with my buddy who worked there and I was giving my review of it. And it's going to sound like such a pretentious douche, but this was the review. To this day, I remember so vividly standing there in the middle of the store saying that I found Superman Earth 1 to be utterly devoid of any warmth, wit, or charm. That was my review back in 2010. I was not a fan, and I didn't even read volumes 2 or 3 until now.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I was not on board with these.
Oh, I've loved just the way that they're designed and laid out, and the art and the story in them. I liked the darker tone for the origin, and I'm kind of amazed to hear that you didn't get past the first issue.
Yeah, as far as I can remember, I definitely didn't read the third one. It's funny though, reading volume 2 for this episode, it did ring some bells. Maybe I had looked at it at the store, but I don't remember actually, owning it. But I mean, I say all of that to share that my initial experience with Earth One was not a positive one.
Yeah,
I definitely enjoyed it more for purposes of this. Although it's funny because I know you tweeted about our recording, and a bunch of people responded, and one, I think Rob from the Superfan podcast was not into Earth One, but I think like pretty much everyone else who replied to that tweet, they were all like, I really love Earth One, and it's my favorite take on the Superman origin, and there seemed to be a lot of positivity.
Yeah, I think someone said it's an underrated take, and they're really that I think that's an accurate description because it's kind of a forgotten piece of Superman history that a lot of people don't know about. I remember reading on the back of the front cover too, the writer for the Man of Steel at the time, he was working on the script for Man of Steel. He was, he wrote a review for it. I don't remember it word for word, but I can see where a lot of things that happened in book 1 or volume 1 may have inspired him for his Man of Steel movie. So yeah.
Yes, David Goyer. I clocked that as well in seeing that on the back cover. And yeah, I mean, reading this, and for anyone who's not familiar, it's a fresh retelling of Clark's beginnings as Superman, his arrival in Metropolis, getting the job at the Daily Planet, actually donning the costume, and he contends over the course of these 3 volumes with an invasion by the alien planet that actually was responsible for the destruction of Krypton. He takes on a version of Parasite and a version of Zod, and meets and develops a relationship with a non-Lois Lane love interest, which was a different spin. So, but yeah, reading it, I mean, it definitely made me think of Zack Snyder's Man of Steel. There, especially thematically, the whole question of how the world would receive someone with these powers. And certainly in that first volume, the fact that it's this alien invasion that draws him out and prompts him to step forward into the world. It's not a Kryptonian invasion, but it's close enough. So yeah, you definitely see ways in which, there was some inspiration there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In the first volume alone, when Clark gets hit by that solar blast, that really reminded me of Man of Steel with the gravity beam, but we could talk about that later too.
Yeah. Oh, and even a more recent potential inspiration, I thought of Superman and Lois reading volume 2 when he fights Parasite, and there's this whole bit where his Kryptonian ship says to him, the AI explains that if Parasite totally drains the solar energy from your cells, it could damage the cells and you might remain powerless. And I have to imagine that someone from the Superman and Lois writing staff have read that, because as you and I are recording this, we're in the midst of that right now in season 2 of the show.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I could definitely see, I mean, I hope that the people writing Superman and Lois have read some Superman comics, but I can definitely see that correlating.
So yeah, I certainly get the sense you're more positive on these books than I am. I'll give my overall impression of these 3 volumes of Superman Earth One. Overall, I did enjoy them. I found them to be a worthwhile reading project. I found them to be very brisk reads, which is either a compliment or not. I don't know. I read real fast.
Yeah, they're very brief.
Yeah, I mean, because they're 3 full length original graphic novels, and they didn't take too long to get through. So I think they're very readable. They're very brisk, and there wasn't anything that I was so put off by, but they did not resonate with me the way that I think they did with you or some of the folks who responded to your tweet. And I think that in part it might be I don't think that I'm ultimately the intended audience for this. I think they really were designed to introduce new readers to Superman, either people who had never read comics before or people who had read comics but were like, I'm not interested in Superman. And that's not me. I've pored over every telling of this character's origin story. So, I don't think that I was necessarily the intended target here, which is fine. Like, I don't need to be for every story. And I think that for the most part, I couldn't help. And I really tried, but I couldn't help but compare what I was reading to what I saw in Man of Steel or what I read in Superman Birthright or some of the other origin stories. And, the comparison didn't ultimately land in Earth One's favor, and that's not its fault. But, so I was sort of contending with that. I did think that there were some clever, interesting, fresh spins on traditional aspects of the mythology. We could talk about that. I thought there were some clever spins. I thought there were other choices that sort of felt to me like a change for change's sake, but I didn't necessarily think it was the right one or one that added something tremendously of value to me. But again, that's just me. Overall, like I said, I'm glad that I read them. But now, so for you, having gone back to them, like, did they hold up for you?
The first one definitely does hold up for me. It was such a bright burn, but as the series went on, it got a little dimmer and dimmer. Especially the third book, it lost its overall feel by the third book. And to be honest, it felt a little rushed and kind of like they were coming to an end, which it did. But the first book still held up for me. I still really enjoyed seeing the Daily Planet issue tie-in at the back. The second one also had a Daily Planet issue tie-in, but it was a lot smaller. But the story overall was pretty interesting. But the third one, I got bored. It was a struggle to get through again.
I hear you. And so far we've mentioned the writer of these works, Straczynski. We'll touch on the artist for a moment here. So Shane Davis drew volumes 1 and 2.
Yeah.
I had not. I remember when he was doing these books, I had not kept track of him since. I just sort of checked in the other day to see, what was going on. I noticed that he is a member of the Comicsgate group, movement, whatever you want to call it. That's not something that I'm a part of. Make of that what you will, but that was sort of what I learned and sort of doing a little bit of prep for this. And then I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name right, but Ardian Syaf drew volume 3. And I was not familiar with this artist at all outside of the Earth One book that we read. And so I looked him up and discovered that this is back in 2017. There was an issue of X-Men Gold that he drew. And there were all of these anti-Semitic and anti-Christian messages that were embedded throughout the issue. So, I say all of this to say that, there's a little bit of baggage, I guess, associated with these books here that, again, I was not aware of when I embarked upon this. And, it is what it is, and people can draw their own conclusions. But that was sort of what we discovered as we were making our way through these.
I wasn't aware of that either until you pointed it out a few days before, or I think it was yesterday. And it was disappointing to learn because the art was a major factor of why I enjoyed these books. And now there's like a bitterness behind it for me. And it definitely changed the way I look at the books, but, and I in no way want to support those artists for what they're trying to put out there in the world. But
yeah, no, I listen. I understand, but I mean, look, as you know, and as the audiences know, I tend to focus more on the writing side of these stories when we discuss them. Anyway, and bringing this back to Straczynski, like I said, I read his autobiography in advance of this. I bought it about a year ago, like kind of early on into this podcast, because I knew I would get to Earth One at some point, and I was like, I knew this was out there, and it was called Becoming Superman. And the cover of the book, it's his an illustration of his closet, and there's like the George Reeves costume hanging there. And I remember reading about it when it came out, and so again, I picked it up last year, and then in advance of this recording, I was like, well, now's the time. Let me at least read a few chapters. And it's a pretty thick book, and I got through the whole thing in a couple of days. I was really riveted by it, more so than Earth One, to be perfectly honest. I really do encourage people to check out the Straczynski book, Becoming Superman. It's nonfiction, so it's not like I can technically spoil anything, but at the same time, I think I would be doing it a disservice if I laid out his entire life history. I think people should experience it through the book. But what I'll say is this: he experienced a truly horrific upbringing that was filled with abuse of all kinds, physical, sexual, emotional. It was really harrowing. The family moved virtually every year, so he was constantly having to start new schools and try to fit in. There was bullying. There were beatdowns from classmates. There were nights sent to bed without food and not having enough heat. I mean, there like anything that you could imagine was part of the story. And overall, just this absolute absence of affection from either parent. And I read this over Father's Day weekend. It was like, it was heartbreaking. And it was one of those things where I know I talk a lot on the show about becoming a dad and how that changed my perspective so much. And it's like, even before our son was born, like even when we just knew we were having him, it's like, it was just this instinct of like, I have to give him my best. Mm-hmm. It's like, I have to. Like, I'll get philosophical for a second. Like, I don't think there's much that's really owed in this world. Like, I believe more than anything, you owe yourself. You owe a lot to yourself. I don't know that there's much else that's really owed. But I think as a parent, you owe your kid their best, like the best that you can do. You got to try. So to read this story where he had the exact opposite experience, it was heartbreaking. I mean, like tearing up talking, like it was heartbreaking. And it's kind of shocking he made it out the way he did and was able to build this career for himself. And that's a big part of the story as well, is how he found this escape in writing and in Superman, how Superman was this inspiration, and he found this outlet in writing. And a good part of the book too, it's not all the heavy stuff. A good part of the book is about him navigating the comic book industry and Hollywood. So there's that aspect of it too, which is fascinating in its own right. But I'm glad that I read it. I mean, just on a human level, it really gave a lot of insight, but it also did shine a light for me on I guess his approach to Superman. And there are a couple of instances which we can unpack where you see, and I read the book first, and then I read Earth One, and it's like you could see instances where what he went through informed the way he's approaching the character and presenting the character. So it was a fascinating exercise overall.
Yeah, you mentioned his origin story in passing, and I didn't dive too deep because I did want to hear it and give you my initial reaction. And I did not know that about him, but now that you're mentioning it, I can kind of see those themes woven into these stories. There are, at least especially in the second book, there are instances of abuse, and be it substance abuse or abuse of different kinds. There's this one moment in the second book where Lisa, I forget her last name, but it's another double alliteration with L's, and she is about to be assaulted, and Superman saves her. And that kind of gives it more impact because he himself has went through something like that and probably wished he would have been saved. So that's a very emotional thing to go through. And I'm going to have to give that book a read.
I do recommend it. Let's take a quick commercial break. And then there are a few specific examples that I want to point to where I can see his background informing choices that he made. So let's take a quick commercial break and then we'll discuss. We'll be right back. Acme Comics is a locally owned and operated full-service comic book store in Greensboro, North Carolina for people of all ages and walks of life. Since 1983, this 9-time Eisner Award nominee uses their collective knowledge and resources to connect you with the best material available. They pride themselves on their significant contemporary and vintage back issue selection. Mail order subscriptions to new releases are available, and all offerings are available to anyone, anywhere, via mail order. Follow Acme on social media and eBay, listen to the Acme Cast on all podcast services, and visit acmecomics.com for much more. Film lovers and filmmakers should check out this family of film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and In the Cut in Bloomfield, New Jersey. I was fortunate enough to have my work shown at these festivals, and I found them to be very enjoyable and well-run events. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals generally, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news and updates about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, be sure to listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and currently under new ownership, Moose sells a wide selection of new and old comics from every publisher, action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Flat Squirrel Productions is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP, that's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions, to save 10% on your order, and it helps support the show. Thank you. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations: Skokie, Illinois, Muncie, Indiana, or Harrison, New York, which happens to be my local comic shop. If you have kids and are looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Aw Yeah. And we're back. So like I said, especially after reading the autobiography, it definitely clarified some of the story choices in Straczynski's Superman work. Even before Earth 1, I mentioned earlier, he had started this grounded arc in the monthly Superman title right before the New 52. And he ended up only writing 4 issues before he left to focus on Earth 1. But the gist of it was that Superman was going to walk America and sort of reconnect with the common person and their everyday issues. Sort of the inciting incident for this, for people who haven't read it or don't remember, is Superman's been off dealing with this was at the end of the New Krypton arc. So he's been off dealing with New Krypton. He comes back and there's this press conference and this woman comes up and slaps him. And she's like, while you were off doing all of this, like, my husband died from a tumor and you could have caught it with your x-ray vision and used your heat vision to remove it. And I feel like that might be putting a little bit much on Superman, but in any event, this idea that he's often dealing with these world-threatening or universe-threatening crises, and that he might have lost sight of, again, the person on the street, and he's going to try to reconnect through this walkabout, is interesting. I don't know. I mean, from what I've read, from what I remember at the time and what I've read since, I don't believe that this arc was particularly well received. I don't know that the execution really worked. I do think that the idea was an interesting one. A part of me wonders if this would have made more sense if Clark walked the Earth. I mean, it definitely has a different effect when Superman strolls into town. But again, I guess that makes for, that pops a little bit more as far as the story goes. But the last issue that Straczynski wrote himself was it had a child with a black eye on the cover. And in the story, Superman's going through this town, and he with his super hearing, he hears this child who has been knocked around and locked in his basement, and Superman saves him. He intervenes. And it's one of those things where people, and maybe even myself, if I had read it initially, I don't know, might have thought that it just came across as, I don't even know what word you want to put on it, but not even preachy, but just sort of, I don't even know what I would use to describe it, but knowing what he went through, it's like it's like, oh, like this is what he wished had happened for him.
Yes, exactly.
And now he's able to live that out through this story. So it's like, it totally works in that sense.
I remember that story you're describing vividly. Actually, that is the last arc, or the last part of that arc that I remember reading, and knowing that he himself did go through that, and that he probably did wish for a hero to save him. Like, again, I agree. It gives a new weight to the way he told it.
After school, especially, that might have been the word. That's what I was searching for there. I think maybe it kind of comes across as that if you without knowing sort of the backdrop. So armed with that, I definitely appreciated that story more. And then in the Earth One books, do you remember the whole story that he tells Lisa in volume 2 about the cat?
Yes. Yep.
That moves Lisa to tears. The story about this cat he found, and they bonded, and they were inseparable. And when the cat passed, Clark flew him up to the moon, buried him on the moon, because that's what they would always do. Clark and the cat would sit out on the porch and look up at the moon. I mean, it's, it tugs at the heartstrings.
It's very beautiful, yeah.
So when Straczynski was growing up, again, they moved all the time, and he would often take in a stray cat when they got to their new destination. And when it was time to move again, sort of the deal that his father had made with him was, if the cat was still with us, you can take the cat to our new place. And again, he's a kid, and inevitably what would happen every time it came time for this move is that the cat would have gotten out, or would have died, or couldn't be found. And what Straczynski eventually realized was that his father was responsible for all of this. It wasn't a coincidence that the cats never made it to moving day.
My God.
And so again, and like, again, that's a specific example of stuff in the book. Like, that's the sort of, like, that's what we're dealing with. There's also, I know I said I wasn't going to lay it all out, but this one is particularly, I think will particularly scream at us comic book fans. To punish Straczynski at one point, his father rips up his comic book collection. And we're talking, these are comics from the early 60s. I mean, it doesn't even matter their value or anything like that. Like, they had sentimental value and they meant a lot to him, and his father just ripped them up in front of him. That's the sort of stuff that, we're talking about here. But so when you get to that story that he tells Lisa in volume 2 about this cat, and that they, he was able to be with this cat for the duration of its natural life, and then, put the cat in a place where that, he could always quote unquote see him. Again, it's like working, it's that, I guess, wish fulfillment of what he was deprived of as a kid. And so, something like that, like, so stood out, and it was like, oh, I get why we have this little, the diversion about the cat. Like, that's why.
That just adds an incredibly different artistic and kind of tragically beautiful weight to the stories. I really do need to read his book now, but from what you just described, even with what's in Superman Grounded, besides the child abuse story, I'm at a loss for words. That's just incredibly beautiful that he put those tragic experiences into something that he loved, so someone else reading it could find hope in a way. I feel like that's what he was trying to convey now that I'm seeing it through that lens. And that's incredibly brilliant. And I don't know how else to describe it.
And that's, like I said before about Earth One generally, I don't know that I was the intended audience, right? I wasn't a new Superman reader, but, and similarly here, with something like that, that Grounded issue that we're talking about, it's like, I'm fortunate that I did not experience that, but it's like, maybe for someone who has experienced that or is experiencing that, and they have that story and that offers something for them, then it's worthwhile. And yeah, above all that, he was able to channel this into something. I guess the last but big picture way I think that his upbringing influenced the way he approaches Superman is, in these Earth One books, I feel like Superman or Clark's social and emotional development, at least at the outset, is far more stunted than we've seen before. He's far more alienated and withdrawn than other tellings of the story. And that was a big part of the book as well. And I think this was born out of the abuse and keeping that secret, but also the moves, the fact that he was just constantly moving and, would always try to do whatever he could to fit in as much as possible to not get picked on. So, whatever, mimicking speech patterns of like whatever it was to just sort of blend in as much as possible, but to the detriment of his own personality development. So it became this thing where he didn't really have as distinct an identity of himself because he was just used to being this chameleon and constantly changing. And so, so I think that was a big part of his personal journey. And I think you see that in this version of Clark, who really, again, is far more withdrawn and has a harder time connecting on any level. And I really think, I have to imagine that that's born out of his experience.
Yeah, no, I can totally see that. You mentioned Straczynski is a former journalist, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And I didn't know if the listeners knew that or not, but I didn't know that. And you can see Clark in the books come out of his shell when he is at the Daily Planet and kind of grows into his own there, because that is something he liked to do. And I can now see Straczynski doing that as well when he found his own wherever he ended up as a journalist.
Yeah, totally. And so on that note of the journalism, let's talk about that, especially given your background. Like I said, I think the Daily Planet gets a fair amount of play here. And I think, I would say that the Perry and the Lois are fairly traditional. Lois ends up not being a love interest, which we'll talk about, which is a different twist on it. But we gotta talk about Jimmy Olsen.
Oh God. He looks like a 30-year-old man he looks way older than Clark. I don't know if that was like an inspiration from Smallville, but it's very off-putting because he's not the meek little photographer that we're also used to, like the one that is like, yes, Miss Lane and Mr. Kent or something like that. The bow tie wearing, freckled faced redhead following behind Lois to take a photo. He's kind of a smartass to Perry too, and it's just very off-putting.
See, I get that. For me, it worked. And here's the thing that's tough, and I don't envy Straczynski in this respect when you're doing one of these origin stories from the ground up and you're not shackled by any continuity. Like we talked about this when I talked to Mark Waid himself about Birthright. It's like, he diverged a bit from the established continuity, but it wasn't a total 180. At the end of the day, the idea was that we're still in this post-crisis John Byrne mold of the character. Yes, we're going to have some changes with this, but it's not like a radical overhaul. He still had to work within the confines of the established continuity. Whereas here you don't. And so I imagine that becomes a tough thing. It's like, how much familiarity should there be? How familiar should these versions of the characters be such that Superman fans are, find something to latch onto, aren't put off, aren't nitpicky about it, although that will always happen, myself included, versus doing something that's new and different and that might appeal to a different audience. So I think that's a very tough line to walk. I like this version of Jimmy. I feel like Jimmy can use a bit of an update, and age aside, I think the thing that I just loved was he's this action photographer. It's like, this guy gets the shot no matter what, and he does not back down. It's kind of, it's almost insane at a certain point, the level of danger that he's putting himself in. The alien invaders in the first issue, they think he might be the alien they're looking for.
I know, that's insane to me. That just kind of shows how great he is. And it does bring a cool and I guess, needed angle to him too, because he's supposed to be this Pulitzer Prize winning journalist or photographer in mainstream continuity, and you don't get to see that. It's almost like he's accidentally great, but in here he is purposefully great. I wish he would have been more, for me at least, I wish he would have been more the recognizable Jimmy than the one we got to see.
Gotcha. What was your take on Perry and just the depiction of the newspaper and the newsroom itself?
Okay. Well, Perry, he wasn't very different.
No.
Most incarnations that's what I see as Perry. I don't feel we get to see Perry enough because he is a great character.
We never get to see Perry enough, ever. There's never enough Perry.
No, there's not. Great Caesar's ghost. There's not. But my favorite, Great Shades of Elvis, as my favorite Perry White would say from Lois and Clark. But no, he was his hard-nosed kind of dad role journalism guy at the Daily Planet. One of my favorite things, though, about the Daily Planet and this is it was a failing newspaper, and that was very interesting to me. There were the newsroom was dilapidated. It was dirty, dingy, mostly empty. You only got to see it, maybe a few background characters, and then there's Lois and Jimmy and Perry's assistant, which her name escapes me, but she kind of reminded me of Harley Quinn. And then Perry, and they were kind of holding the bullpen together, and I liked that. It wasn't because Secret Origins did something like that, but it was a great take on newspapers, because around that time a lot of newspapers were struggling because the digital era was taking hold and they didn't really know how to adjust. So I enjoyed seeing that.
Yeah, I appreciated that as well. I think, it's true to life. It also helps explain how someone with as little experience as Clark has could end up getting a job. I mean, yes, he ends up also coming in with the Superman exclusive, but even that aside,
we'll talk about that later. Gosh.
Oh, the ethical implications of that. Sure.
Yeah.
But I like this, the struggling Daily Planet. It certainly makes sense. I mean, it's so funny, especially over the course of doing this podcast and jumping around in time and looking at the George Reeves show from the 50s or even Lois and Clark from the 90s. And it's like, they seem to have these endless expense, accounts and budgets. It's like, especially when they go on location, they're taking these trips and it's like Lois and Clark and they bring Jimmy, and it's just like, man, like what a different time.
Yep.
I think one of my favorite Perry moments in this, I agree, I think it's a very traditional take on the character, nothing outside the box, but I did love at the start of volume 2 where Clark is admiring the framed photo of his article interviewing Superman, and Perry has this moment with him and he's like, do you know why I framed those? It's like, it's not to memorialize, like that's part of it, but it's because it's old news. Like you got to get on to the next thing, you got to keep moving forward. I thought that was a nice touch, a nice moment there.
Yeah. No, I myself, frame stories and that's not the reason why I do it. It's because it's a mark of success for me. But I liked his point of view, because in the world of journalism, you're only as great as your current story. And it could be a story you've just printed or you're working on or you just tweeted about, but you have to keep working hard and doing the work. And I actually learned a lot from Perry throughout these books and in Superman comics in general. So I did enjoy that he was more classic Perry in these.
And what was your take on this Lois?
It was an interesting take on Lois. She was Lois nonetheless. I did like how she wasn't initially like a love interest for Clark. I like to believe that over time they'd become friends, like in Lois and Clark or any other interpretation. Smallville, which is my favorite, where they were like frenemies, and then they uh, they grew to become best friends, and then fell in love, and then got married. I love that interpretation, and I feel like that's kind of how it started on Superman and Lois too. And I feel like that's where this might have gone if it continued. But I liked that she wasn't just the damsel for him to save all the time. There were times he did save her, sure, but she was just this hard-nosed journalist that he competed with at the Planet, or worked with, or inspired him as well to even finally make the decision to join the Daily Planet. So yeah, I did like this take.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of conflicted. I said before, some of the changes felt like changes for change's sake. By the end of the trilogy here, Straczynski has positioned Lois effectively as Superman's Commissioner Gordon. I mean, to the point where there's the Superman signal in the sky, and she's standing on the rooftop, and she's offering him some advice. And I mean, other than that, I mean, again, she is that hard-nosed reporter. She investigates Clark. Right, when he comes off the street with this amazing exclusive interview with Superman, and she digs into his background. Wouldn't? Of course. So I think she hits the beats that you would expect. I think this is where I'm conflicted, because on the one hand, I definitely don't think that Lois should only be defined or even be defined by her the romantic relationship with Clark or Superman. Exactly. Right? She needs to stand on her own. But where's the line? Because I mean, that's one of the things. You so associate those two characters with each other in that context. And so to eliminate it, I guess and especially to then sort of replace it with that Commissioner Gordon dynamic, I don't know. I'm not like offended by it, but I don't know that I love it.
It doesn't feel right in Superman lore. And that's why I was hoping more that they become like a partnership instead. I hated the Superman logo in the sky. I hated that so much. That belongs in Gotham and Batman. It just, if she needs his attention, she could literally just say, Superman, come here. I don't know why they had to go that much into it, but I agree with you as well. She shouldn't be defined by her relationship with him. In any instance, I guess Superman and Lois, it's one of those, they've always been together since the very start, and it was Jerry and Joe's initial intention for them to get together. But I agree with you. She shouldn't be defined by her relationship with him, and for a long time she was, and I enjoyed the aspect where in this story she wasn't.
I think you hit the nail on the head for me though, because it's not even so much that like, oh, they weren't romantically involved, but it's like they were barely involved at all. Yeah. I think that's the thing. I think if you had seen them sort of working a story together, that would have gone a long way for me.
Exactly. Yes.
That was the problem. That was more the problem I had with it. I think you got at the heart of it.
I kind of, the Lisa character of it all, I wish there would have been more Lois interaction where Lois was here. Like, I wish he told that cat story to Lois, for instance, or bonding over friendships like that. Or bonding over Clark's past and becoming friends over something like that. Because we all know, I don't know this version of Lois, but Lois hasn't had the greatest backstory either, with her family always moving and stuff. And I feel like they could have shared their past experiences and kind of grown closer. Instead, she kind of looked like a reporter scorned for missing the big scoop because she didn't get the interview with Clark, with Superman, and Clark, quote unquote, did get the interview with Superman.
Right.
And I understood her anger because she was a reporter at the Daily Planet, but and he wasn't. And I don't know. I don't really. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I hear you. with the Lisa character, so this was his neighbor, Lisa LaSalle, right? His neighbor in this building, and she's an aspiring model and actress. But as we and Clark find out relatively early on, to make ends meet, she hooks on the side, as she says. Yep. So she's an escort or prostitute, whatever you want to call it, and
a sex worker. I think
a sex worker, yeah, sure.
Yep.
And I think what worked about it was, you see Clark's lack of judgment towards her, right? He still continues to develop this friendship, which later, by the end of the third volume, it seems to be segueing into something even more meaningful. But, he doesn't, judge or ostracize her or anything like that.
Yeah.
And, you see the parallels between the characters. Like, she has this secret that she's been keeping that she's afraid will change the way people look at her. And when she shares it with Clark, he doesn't turn his back on her. Just as Clark obviously is harboring this massive secret as well, which Lisa discovers in the third volume. She's rooting through his closet and she finds his costume.
Yep. Did Lisa remind you of anybody, by the way, when she was first introduced?
Oh, like Mary Jane?
No, I was thinking more Lana.
Well, the red hair, sure.
Visually, she looked like Lana. And I was wondering if you do, like, was she supposed to be an original take on Lana Lang?
Not as far as I know. I don't know if Straczynski has addressed that anywhere. Obviously with the LL and the red hair, it certainly calls that character to mind. But, and here's the other thing I'll say in defense of this. I did like the development of their relationship first as friends. And I did enjoy that. And I guess here's the thing. If you're not going to put Lois and Clark together, you might as well explore other romantic paths for the characters. And I feel like when we, whether New 52 or whatever, same thing. And we're going to be covering that on upcoming episodes, but there too, the Superman Wonder Woman of it all, is that my preferred take? No, but
no way.
But it's like, if you're going to start over and you're not going to have them together, it's like, well, all right, like take this opportunity to explore this other territory. So I did appreciate the attempt at a new character, and I did enjoy the dynamic between them, and there was a tenderness there. I felt, and you really got to see them find some comfort and some common ground in each other. So I don't really have a bad word to say about Lisa herself. As a longtime Superman fan, it was weird.
Yeah.
It was weird not to see Lois and Clark really interacting much, generally, not having any sort of romantic entanglement. And, for Clark to be, embarking on this relationship with a wholly original character. Like, it's not, if Lana showed up from Smallville, it's like, oh, okay, like, we have this familiarity. Like, this was kind of a big swing, I think, from the story.
I did appreciate that they kept the double L alliteration there.
Yes.
As most of Clark's love interests have LLs. So I did appreciate that.
So, I said before that thematically, this shares a lot of the same DNA with Man of Steel. Clark's sort of agonizing over whether or not to step out into the world and then the world's reaction to him.
Yes.
It's the irony is not lost on me, because as even upon reread, I kept coming back to this, the word cold. Like, there was a coldness to the proceedings. And I think that's born a lot out of, again, the alienation that Clark feels. I think that sort of permeates the stories. But as a reader and as a Superman fan, that's not necessarily the feeling that I want to have. And I recognize, I'm going to say it before anyone thinks it or tweets it at me, I recognize that as someone who loves the Snyder movies, that, I know what the criticisms are of the movies. And I feel like that's one of the things that's often lobbed at the Snyder movies. And again, I don't share that, but I do sort of see it in these books. And so I think that was one of the things that was a little bit of a roadblock for me. Not like they're these soulless stories. There's some heart there, but overall, just this sense of coldness that I just kept coming back to.
Can I ask, like, what made you feel the most cold in these stories?
That's the thing. I wish I could pinpoint. I was thinking about it. It's like, what? Like, it's not like, that's the thing. It's not like, oh, like this one thing.
Yeah.
It was just sort of like the vibe of it.
Yeah, no, I can see that. They are very, visual wise, they are very muted. And they are very, it's like a darker world in a way. I don't want to say hopeless, because it's not hopeless 100%, but it is it is visually and tonally, there's dark tones in there, and I think it's more realistic that way, at least for someone who has seen abuse. And relating back to Straczynski's past, I do think he wrote the story for himself or for people like him, and keeping that in mind does myself bring, for me at least, bring a different light to the stories. But I can totally see where you're coming from with the criticisms and relating it to the Snyderverse. I never understood those criticisms for the movies. I do get other criticisms. Everybody has their own takes of something, and no, I can see where you're coming from with your coldness.
Yeah, but building off of what you were saying, about how Straczynski's experience informed this, I think that's the thing that I can recognize and understand and accept, is that, because I was really thinking about this a lot too, how this Clark was different, had a harder time relating. I mean, there are scenes at the beginning, like where he's looking into the diner and he's seeing people there, and he puts on the hood and he walks away, and it's like,
yeah,
I think, like, just thinking about my own experience, I was, comic book fan when no one, at school was. So I had like this thing that was a big part of my life, but I didn't really share it until I started working at the comic book store. And then it was like this whole other world opened up to me. And I mean, I was out of shape and overweight until college. So, there was always that part. I was very self-conscious, and so I think some of the themes that you often see explored, especially in a Superman origin story, I can identify with, but, thankfully, like, I've never felt the degree of alienation that the Clark in this story does. And, even when we get the glimpses into his upbringing, whether it's through flashbacks or Lois's investigation, I mean, this is like Clark's time in Smallville is like what we saw on the television show, but like to another level. I mean, he's really not engaged. Like, he purposely gets C's in all of his classes so he can just like fly under the radar. You don't really get the sense that there was Alana or that anything developed between them. And so I just think like that doesn't necessarily speak to me, but it doesn't have to. Like, again, like, that's the thing. It's okay, and I get it, but I think that's why it's a little harder for me to latch on to this character, because it's like I felt some of the things, like some of the versions of things that other iterations of Clark have felt, but this was like a little bit beyond for me. So I think I had a harder time like really connecting and being like, oh, like, I totally get what he's feeling here. Mm-hmm. But I get why other people would. Like, I do get that.
Yeah, that's one of the great things one of the things I love about Superman and all his other takes is because each story can mean something special to someone else. And I love that. And that's why I never knock a story involving my favorite characters, because what I might not like might be why someone else loves them. And no, I enjoy those perspectives, and I think they matter.
Going back to the Becoming Superman book, Straczynski talks about watching the George Reeves show. That was before the comics for him. That was the thing that introduced him to Superman, and that offered him this salvation, that there was someone who was just like this good and strong and pure and would stand up for people. And I mean, I happen to love the George Reeves show, but if someone watches it now and they're like, oh, this is, hokey, this 50s show, it's like, well, like, that might have been the only salvation for this author, as a child. Sure. So it's like, it means, like, things mean, different things to people, and you don't always know, but I agree with you. It's like, and it's important to, have that respect and understanding.
When did those shows, they came out in the mid 50s, right?
52 to 58.
Yeah. It probably meant a lot to a lot of people, because it was a light, it was very, I don't want to say campy, but it was very light and fluffy. And especially for people coming right off of World War II, like fresh off maybe a few years, dealing with that trauma. So I can see how others would relate to light and fluffy, but no, I completely agree. He probably watched that and saw that take, and he's like, I wish that man would have saved me. Yeah. I wish they need to put that on HBO Max, because I was watching that on DC Universe and they took it off, and I mean, they took everything off, and I was so mad.
Here, now we come to my regularly scheduled rant about what's not available. I mean, I bought them all on DVD because I just got to the point where I was like, you know what, I just want to know that I have them.
Yeah.
But it's ridiculous that they're not. Again, I say this a lot, but I just feel like, as for Warner Brothers with all of the shows and movies, and with DC with the comics, I feel like, just from the historical perspective, there's a certain measure of responsibility here in preserving and presenting this material. It's I don't know. Obviously I'm biased as a Superman fan, but I feel like the place that the character occupies deserves more. Anyway, that's a side thing. But as far as the Kents and Martha in particular, right? Because in these stories, Jonathan has just passed within the past year. We don't know how or why. We don't get any of that. But we know that he's passed, and Clark has these phone calls with Martha, and we also see some flashbacks. And I mean, I guess what was your take on the Kents in this, and the advice that they gave him, especially with respect to what his role in the world would be?
And especially in the first one, when he's coming out as Superman, or he's about to, or contemplating what to do with his life, he is he's a new implant in Metropolis, and he's trying to find his way. And he's Superman; he can do whatever he wants. He's brilliant. He's creative, and if he focuses in his energy somewhere, he could literally do whatever he wants. And we get to see that. And he tells his mom he just wants to support her, make sure she's safe. She's done so much for him. And she comes back and she's like, Clark, that's great and all, and I appreciate it. But I want you to do what's best for you. You know what I want from you, but that might not be what's best for you. And just hearing that is so incredible, because the Kents are just so wise in a lot of incarnations, and this one especially, his mom just really hit the nail on the head. She just was such a supportive mom. She knew that he was struggling, and she didn't push him. She didn't try to sway him to do whatever he didn't want to do. And I don't know, there's just this respect there that they had for each other that I really enjoyed. And I love when he calls his parents, because he literally could just fly over there and see them whenever he wants. But just knowing that they're there and they always pick up, it's such a nice, one of those anchors for Clark to stay grounded.
Yeah, I mean, totally. And I enjoyed the phone calls. And then at the end, when he brings Lisa there and they have their in-person meeting, I mean, one of the moments that really just broke my heart was in volume 3, when he's fighting Zod, and this looks like it's going to be it for him. And he grabs a phone from one of the citizens on the street, and he just calls his mom, and he's like, I think this is it. I love you. Like, it's heartbreaking. He
had such a connection with Martha in this, something that he had in Smallville too. I think that's why I loved it so much. Yeah, I was about to go deep there, but I'll wait a little bit. I don't know. I guess growing up myself, I didn't have that connection with my own mom. I was raised by my grandparents, but I did have that connection with my grandma. And it's something I wish I had with my mom, but recognized with my grandma, and seeing that represented in such a way is always so nice, for me, at least. And then seeing it represented in a way that I wish I also had experienced it's one of the reasons why I love Superman, is his connection with his parents, especially his mom.
No, I understand. I mean, look, I've spoken about it so many times. I mean, I always love the scenes with the Kents and the homespun earthy wisdom that they impart to him. And, Jonathan via flashback, has this whole bit about, how you can sort of be asleep through your life, be sleeping through your life and kind of get stuck. And then, you have these moments where you're tested and you really, have to sort of stand up and see who stands with you and take that action. I've talked about this a lot. I do ultimately gravitate toward the version of the story where the Kents are both alive, but
yeah.
If Jonathan has to have passed, one thing that I do quote unquote like about that is that it opens up more for Martha to do. And so I like that she was really that touchstone for him throughout these stories.
Yeah.
It was interesting in the phone calls and in the flashbacks that Jonathan and Martha were not shoving it down his throat, but like they were encouraging / pushing Clark toward taking the step. They made him the costume. Interesting here. I did not like this. The deviation from the S being the family symbol and standing for hope. I've really come to like that. I know Straczynski doesn't, because he wrote about it in his book when he talked about writing Earth One, how he didn't like this idea that it was the family crest and that it meant hope. So, he went back to them just literally coming up with, the S standing for Superman. Martha's like, I thought S for son. And then Jonathan has this whole thing about like, well, you're not just a man, like you're this extraordinary man, you're a Superman. Which again goes back more to the earlier iterations of the origin story. But again, just kind of a personal thing.
No, I agree with you, because I do like the double meaning that it has. I like that on Krypton, it meant hope, and that on Earth, it meant Superman, which when you saw him meant hope, or what he represents is hope. So I loved that he brought meaning to that. And in this, it kind of negates everything Superman is, because that symbol, we're both wearing it on our chest right now. It means something to people. And just having it just some random, I just put it there because this reminded me of you, kind of really dilutes the meaning behind it. So I like that it meant something there on a planet that died and now is bringing some new life to the meaning on a planet full of life that this dead planet's last son is trying to protect. I love that. And I wish it did translate into this as well, but oh well.
Yeah. Well, I recently rewatched Batman v Superman for one of our Lex episodes, and one of my favorite scenes between Clark and Lois on the balcony of the hotel in DC, where she's like, this means something to people, and he's like, it did on my world, but here it's it's just an S, and it's like, but that's the thing, like it's important for it to have that meaning. So again, that was a deviation I didn't really love, but it's funny. My position changed on the Kents in Earth One, because initially I'm like, man, like they're really, again, it feels very divorced from the Jonathan Kent of Smallville. And certainly the Kevin Costner version of Man of Steel, who were really scared for their son about what would happen, what would happen to him, what it would do to the world for him to step out. And
as a dad, who wouldn't be, right?
Look, I always say this, and I know I've said this on the show, but it's like whenever people complain about Pa Kent in Man of Steel, when Clark's like, should I have let them drown? And he's like, maybe. It's like, yeah, you're worried about your son. Like that's the thing. It's like, no, I can understand why you would have that hesitation. So that always made sense to me. Here, I was kind of like, man, like they're really more gung-ho about this than I would think. But what ultimately sort of, unlocked it for me was it's like they just want him to live his best life, essentially. Like they want him to be himself. They don't want him to be, because again, this Clark in this Smallville is just a C student who doesn't do any extracurriculars or have any friends, right? And they don't want him to be like that for his whole life. So that made sense.
Yeah, no. I love that they wanted the best for him. I'll bring back to the original book as well, where Martha says, do what you have to do that's right for you, not what's right for everybody else. Right before that, she told him that she wants him to be Superman, basically, but then she goes and tells him to do what's best for him. And there's kind of a weight of wisdom there. They knew that he had to be his whole self, which means he had to save lives, because they knew he loved to do, or he liked to do that. And they knew that he had this power and he always felt isolated and he hid it from the world. And if he embraced it and shared it with the world, they knew that he would be the best him he could be. And there's a wisdom there that parents just intuitively know. And I did like how they weren't forceful with it, like you mentioned, but they weren't also secretive about how they felt about it either. Yeah.
Yeah. And to your earlier point, that was one of the clever spins that I liked on this, that whole sequence in the first volume where Clark has all of these amazing opportunities and all of these different industries, right? Like he could be this football star. He has this amazing tryout. He has his Goodwill Hunting moment at the laboratory where he like solves this equation that has stumped the best scientists. All of these things. And what he articulates to Martha is like, well, I can use my powers in this way, right? Like I can still sort of have a normal life. Like if I put on that costume, like my life is over essentially. And of course he'll ultimately find the path that we all know. But the fact that he was entertaining those other options, I think it was an interesting thing to see,
Yeah. We don't get to see that a lot because I mean, Superman does have other talents besides just flying in the sky and writing a good piece of journalism. He is brilliant and he is talented in other ways, and but he can't find the meaning for himself personally in those ways, which is this exploring those options was interesting. He could have made, like it pointed out, he could have made buttloads of money, but sorry, that's my dog. He could have made buttloads of money and it wouldn't have meant anything. It would have made his mom live securely, but she didn't care for that. She wanted him to live happily, and him exploring those options was interesting to see. It brings me back to him. There's this one panel and it reads, "Is there anything you want to do, anything at all?" And he's walking along the street and he sees an issue of the Daily Planet, picks it up, and you kind of get the notion, oh, he wants to write. And it brings me to one of my other favorite Superman stories. I can't think of it right now. I think it's Man for Tomorrow or something like that. It's a recent issue.
Oh, wait, is this the Marv Wolfman Man and Superman?
Yeah, Man and Superman. That's
gotcha.
The one. And in it, Clark's talking about writing, trying to get in at the Daily Planet. And this Daily Planet is more reputable and it's kind of like the New York Times. And he doesn't have the experience that position requires there. And he's like, the reason he likes to write is because all of that is talent he has to work for. It's not something gifted to him by being from another planet. And I think I wish it explored that here more, but I think that's where this was going. And I enjoyed that aspect as well. Like, this is a man who could do anything, and he chose to do something that was hard for him because he wanted to work at it.
Totally. I like that a lot too. And he's, he has like a few credits to his name, but not a lengthy resume. And, like his writing needs some work. I mean, Perry gives him a lesson right off the bat about, active versus passive sentence structure. So yeah, there was something kind of endearing about that. Although, look, like I said before, I keep butting up against other preferable versions of the origin story to me. Like one of the things that I always loved about Birthright was that, and I even this was one of the things about Man of Steel that I wish had been a little different. I love in Birthright that he's a journalist first. Like, he's traveling the world, he's covering these stories, he's trying to explore his heritage, and then that, he parlays that into, his role at the Daily Planet. It's not, in a lot of these stories, it just ends up being either a cover or something that's convenient. Here I agree with you. I mean, there seemed to be some sort of spark. You don't get a ton, but like there was that pull in that scene that you mentioned. Yeah, I guess I would have liked that to play out a little differently, but no, I did appreciate the whole sequence of him going through these other possible career paths. I thought that was a nice touch.
Yeah, it was. I really enjoyed when the football tryouts, especially when he was just taking out all these. This Clark, I'd like to note, is like a lot younger than previous versions too. When he's starting out, he's like 20 years old, I think. Yeah,
like he went to junior college. And then he came to Metropolis. Like, you don't have that odyssey around the world, or which again I like. So it was a little bit of a departure. Now, speaking of his age, and this was something I was thinking about. Like, if you were to adapt this specific version of Superman, Earth One specifically, like, are there any actors who come to mind? Because it's like definitely not Henry Cavill. Like this version of the character, is lacking in that physicality. Like he's definitely a lot leaner and smaller.
Yeah,
like is there
you
anyone
definitely see that at the football tryouts. He's just this tiny little guy next to these behemoth of men. But no, not that I can think of. One of my favorite things about past Superman movies is when they cast unknowns or little known actors.
Yeah.
So I'd like to see that again if they ever go back down that route. I mean, I love Henry. We'll not talk about Superman reboots though, because that depresses me. But yeah, yeah, same. But there's this one fan cast a while back that I don't know where this actor is now. I think his name is Daniel or something. He was in The Politician. And he really did look the part.
Oh, you know what? I don't remember his name, but I remember my wife. That's the Ryan Murphy, Ben Platt show on Netflix.
Yeah, yeah.
I know who you're talking about. He was like one of the classmates, because I remember when we were watching that, I turned to my wife. I was like, that guy, guy could play Superman.
yeah. I don't know if his name is Daniel or not, but he is also in the Netflix series Hollywoodland or something as well. And he has this like natural curl and bright blue eyes and chiseled features. He's not like the fittest. He's lean, but I think he would fit that role pretty well.
Yeah. So, we've talked about the supporting cast and the Kents and we're struggling with whether or not to become Superman. Let's talk about the threats, the antagonists that he faces in these stories.
Yeah.
I don't know. What's your big picture? What's your take? Did you find that some worked better than others? Where did you land on these? Because in the first volume, there's again the alien planet, the sister planet of Krypton that was ultimately responsible for its destruction. Which boy, I have thoughts on that. In the second one, we have Parasite. As there's more. And the second volume was interesting because they did spend a lot of time on the Clark and Lisa relationship and some geopolitical maneuvering. But Parasite was our quote unquote villain of the second volume, and then the third one was a new take on Zod who's brother of Jor-El. So, what was your take on these on these antagonists?
They were definitely original takes. The first one kind of felt like a Lobo ripoff. Like if he physically looked like Lobo, and it's like if Lobo was some kind of pretentious prick kind of style. It was okay for a big bad to kind of threaten the world and bring Superman out, because that's all he really did do. That's all he served for. Parasite in the second book, though, was very interesting. Rudy, but it's Rudy, right?
Raymond. Yeah, in this
Raymond. One. No, okay. See, you can't. That I can't keep the names the same because then I can't keep track. But Parasite, his origin was dark. It was dark, and I enjoyed that original take because it made him more of a threat. This serial killer, abusive person, kind of gangster, wrapped up in Iran, got this devastatingly scary power to suck the life out of people, and Superman in power, and it kind of put a big weight on the threat in that book. And with it all being original, you didn't really know who was safe and who wasn't. And it was intense. I liked that threat to it. That counter, especially with original takes like this, because you don't know where things are going to go. Yeah.
What about Zod-El?
I don't always like when Zod is related to the L's. I like that there's either opposing houses or friends to enemy trope. I get some people, if they're they're attracted to the idea of Clark being related to Zod, but I enjoy Zod being separate from the L's because I don't really know. It might be because I'm a little Superman traditional, and that's just how it always has been. But I didn't like they were related, and
That's one of those, again, one of those things, one of those changes that I'm like, I don't know that there's really a great reason for this. And look, I recognize that this, like you said, maybe being a traditionalist, maybe being a little nitpicky, but it's like, if you want to make this a family squabble, you have Zor-El. So like there, you have a template for this.
That's what it's, especially Superman and Lois too. Everybody forgets about the other branch of the L family, and it bugs me because there's already established characters that you could explore in different ways. Why rebrand someone who's already menacing and threatening? And
yeah. And I think with Zod, I just, like you said, the friend to enemy trope, like I always like that parallel between Jor-El and Zod and Clark and Lex. I always like that. And so I feel like you're kind of taking something away, and you could have just used another character. And also, and I know this is a new take, but if we're talking Zod, the fact that he went power mad and he tried to stage a coup, it's like, okay, like that's in line with the Zod we know. But the fact that in retaliation, he would put a hit out on the entire planet. I mean, his whole reason for being is to preserve Krypton and the Kryptonian way of life. So I was just like, I don't know that this totally tracks for me, even with the understanding that, all right, we're dealing in a new universe here. It just, I don't know, it did not feel like Zod to me.
No, I agree with you. I guess it helped tie in the first book to the rest of the series, but
yes,
because the initial villain in the first book was sent by Zod, we later learned. But no, I agree with you, because I like to call Zod a Kryptonian extremist. He wants to impose Kryptonian way of life on everybody else, which means he wants, like we saw it in Man of Steel, he wants to destroy other planets, terraform them, and make it Krypton. I don't ever see him murdering his entire homeworld, because that is his main motive for every choice he makes. And that was disappointing. It also it made him trying to establish a connection with Clark it didn't make sense then, because he's like trying to preserve the last Kryptonians again. And he like, you wouldn't have had to do that, bud, if you didn't destroy the entire planet. Like,
yeah, that's the thing. I feel like, and I've talked about this before in discussing Man of Steel, that, that was the most that I've ever felt for Zod was in that movie, because it's like when he has that line about like, this is what I was like born to do. And, there's the whole thing like on Krypton, they're bred for certain purposes. And it's like, again, you feel for him. It's like, this is his sole, purpose to exist is to try to preserve Krypton. So I felt like we lost more than we gained here.
And I don't know. Yeah, I agree with you. It didn't give a lot of motive behind who Zod was. He was just a killer for killer's sake.
Yeah. So just going back to the other ones real quick. I mean, with Parasite, I've never really had a very strong opinion about Parasite one way or the other. I thought this version, especially for the purpose he was used for, I think worked well. I mean, I don't think he didn't have to carry as much of the story as maybe Zod did in the third one. I thought he was fine. The invaders in volume 1, like you said, they served their purpose of drawing him out. I think Man of Steel, when it came time for the movie, wisely, swapped this, sister planet, that Krypton had been warring with Zod and the other Kryptonians. I've ranted about this before in other episodes. Especially in talking about the Bendis run and his whole bit about Rogol Zar, this villain who is responsible for the destruction of Krypton. I never like the idea that the planet was assassinated. I much prefer it to be a natural disaster, this cautionary tale about abusing your resources. I don't like someone being responsible for it.
There's a natural life cycle to a planet, and I either like when the planet is destroyed by, I don't actually even like when it's destroyed by the sun. I prefer, like you said, a cautionary tale, because there's that adds a whole new dynamic to Superman himself, because he's a survivor of a planet that ended up destroying itself, and our planet we're not exactly taken care of it. So it gives a whole new perspective on his heroics. Like you said, cautionary tale of what we should do, and a Krypton that just ends up going doesn't leave as much of an impact.
Yeah. Now, as far as Zod, again, not a fan of him being a blood relative. The whole sequence where he's pummeling Clark and Clark thinks he's at the end and he calls Martha, like I said before, I thought that was effective. I mean, what was very interesting about that third volume, and especially tying in these themes of like how the world, reacts to him, the governments of the world make this deal with Zod to not intervene, to let Zod kill Superman. And hand in hand with this, we also have this alliance with the Luthors.
Yeah.
Lex and Alexandra Luthor, a married couple. So the Luthors are a pair initially in this story, and they're coming up with this red solar cannon that will deplete Superman of his powers. The alliance with the Luthors made total sense and definitely tracks with what we expect would happen in the real world if a Superman existed. It's like, yeah, the governments would want to have some sort of, fail safe like that. That made sense. The fact that they would align themselves with Zod, who represents the exact same threat as Superman, but they know nothing about, did not ring true for me. I was just like, as little, not to get political, but it's like as little faith as I have in the people in charge, even that felt like a stretch to me.
Yeah. No, especially with Lex Luthor's of the past, he doesn't really trust anybody besides himself, not even the people closest to him. And so this version of the Luthors, especially this version, because they're first introduced as these independent thinking individuals, why would they? I don't know. I feel like there would have been another end game with them there, but I just didn't like it as well. Like you pointed out, it didn't make sense. A lot of motives that they had didn't end up becoming true, if that makes sense. I don't know how better to describe it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think making Luthor 2 was again just one of those things where I felt like, all right, we're putting a little different spin on it, but I don't know how effective this is. I mean, it does get interesting because Lex has the change of heart, right? He uses the solar cannon on Superman, and then as he's watching Zod beat Superman to death, has this change of heart, and then uses it on Zod, but dies in the process because Zod throws this rod through him. And this basically triggers this transformation within Alexandra, where now she's like, by the end of the story, to call me Lex, and it's like she's now the quote unquote Lex Luthor.
Yeah,
I think the thing that it just felt like such a missed opportunity, if Lex and Superman or Lex and Clark had any interaction, any history, anything to sort of, talking about their motives, like to sort of account for this change of heart, anything. I mean, it plays fine, right? That Lex is watching this unfold and is so horrified at the violence and what they've been complicit in, that he has this switch, this flip. But I don't know. I just feel like if you're going to do this, if you're going to have such a turn for a Luthor character, like put some more behind it, like put some more meat on the bone there. It just felt kind of perfunctory. That was an instance where kind of cool could have gone in a better direction. I don't feel like they like really capitalized on that.
Yeah. I feel like the limitations of it being such a smaller graphic novel really might have played into that. I'm not 100% sure, but you can definitely feel in some areas that some stories didn't get that full wraparound as they deserved.
One of the things I really did like that was born out of, I think this was the Parasite volume. I think it was Parasite and not Zod, but I could be mixing them up. But when Superman is powerless and is wandering through the streets, and then he talks to Martha later, and he's like, it really, like this experience of being human and having this fear gave me such a newfound appreciation for humanity. Like, I'm in awe of you, like, to go through life and to be in this danger and to not have this power. I like that. I thought that was a nice, that was a nice, insight into what he was feeling.
Yeah, that was volume 2, right after his first fight with Parasite. And yeah, he was completely depleted of most of his power and just walking around Metropolis in the rain in clothes he got out of a donation box without shoes. And yeah, at the end of that book, he is recalling that to Martha, and it just, I love those moments when Clark, like those ties that make him grounded, like Martha or Lois usually are, or Jonathan when he's still alive, or even Lana. All of those characters remind him of where he's been, who he is, and that he is not just some god who can push an entire planet out of orbit. He's a person. And yeah, I love when you get to see him exploring those thoughts that he has regarding that.
For
process.
Sure. Yeah. So, before we give our sort of our final thoughts on this, what is there anything else that we haven't talked about yet? Big or small, any moments, any characters, anything like that we haven't talked about that you wanted to?
I'd like to talk about the journalism angle again. How in the first book, Jimmy being a photojournalist and Lois being on the ground and Clark reporting on himself. I rolled my eyes there for your listeners. That I liked to see that Superman saved the planet in a way. Like, they got the exclusive, they got the only photos, they got the copyright for the photos. They basically trademarked Superman, and it brought the planet out from the ashes they were in. And you saw that in the later volumes that they were this top-notch, reputable newspaper that we're all familiar with again. I really enjoyed that. Clark's ethics aside, one thing I've always not hated, I guess, very much disliked, made sense, I guess, is when Clark reports on himself. But that's a whole nother thing. But yeah, I really enjoyed watching the planet kind of grow.
Yeah, that was cool to see. And I am with you. I've never really been a fan of that either. This whole idea of him reporting on himself. I mean, I guess if it's once to get the job,
yeah,
and he doesn't continue to do it, it's like, all right, I'm a little bit more okay. But again, I don't know. And then to sort of use that as a source of tension between Lois and Clark, that he scooped her in that respect. Yeah, I don't know. It especially as we move forward in time, I think that plays worse and worse in a variety of ways.
Yeah. Through a 2022 lens, it's definitely questionable. To get the job, I can understand. I think he did it in the original Man of Steel books back in the early 80s as well. And then he scooped Lois, and Lois and him had the dynamic again like they do here. But one thing that I do like about current Superman show, Superman and Lois, is the exploration they have of Lois's past journalism experience and her own ethics brought into question, as well as Clark's. I wish they would question Clark's a little more, but I enjoy that they're exploring that dynamic more. And I wish that it was kind of explored as this story went on, but it kind of was forgotten. But yeah,
I do.
Clark should not report on himself.
I agree. And I also agree with you about Superman and Lois. I think that what they have gotten into in the season 2 has been interesting. Yeah. I think there's more that they can do there. I've enjoyed talking about Earth 1 probably more than I enjoyed reading it, but
yeah,
all in all, just to sort of tie up my own thoughts on this, I think that, like I said before, it was meant for a certain audience, and I certainly hope that for anyone who read this as their introduction to the character, I hope it worked and it was effective. I could see ways in which it would be. I think, like I said, for me, the biggest roadblocks were just, again, this more alienated Clark than necessarily resonated with me, and also just sort of having in my head these other, for me, more compelling takes on the origin that I'm comparing it to. But there was still a lot of interesting stuff. Again, I think they're worthwhile reads if anyone has never read them. It's crazy to think that it's been over a decade since the first one came out. It doesn't seem like there will be any subsequent volumes of this, which, you know, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I'm not heartbroken, but at the same time, you know, it would have been interesting. Maybe some of the things that we're talking about here maybe would have been explored in a subsequent volume, but you get the sense that this was meant to be the 3-volume trilogy that it was. And, and, you know, it certainly reads that way. So for anyone who's never checked it out, I know we've basically spoiled all of it, but if you've never read it, I think it's worth the read. It's not, you know, I've covered the origin tellings pre and post crisis. This would not rank very highly for me, but I respect the place that it does occupy, and it was definitely fun to talk about. So I thank you for coming along for me on this flight. And any other thoughts you want to share before we sign off?
No, that's all. I mean, again, reading it in a 2022 lens, after losing my grandma and my mom myself, those Martha moments are pretty impactful, but I definitely get where you're coming from. I do have a question though for you. What is your favorite origin story so far that you've revisited as an adult?
I mean, it remains Birthright. Birthright's my favorite. Although I mean, I love Man of Steel, but Birthright remains number one. And again, I do recognize that Earth One came before Man of Steel. I get that. So, you know, so it's maybe unfair to be like, well, I like Man of Steel so much better. It clearly borrowed a lot from Earth One. So if nothing else, it's like, I do appreciate the sort of the inspiration or foundation that it laid for a version of the story that I like a lot more.
Yeah. No.
You know, but Birthright, it remains number one for me.
Birthright is it's a classic. I guess it is a classic now, but it is a great take on Superman. I actually have that copy myself over there. And I enjoy the art and the story in it, and the Daily Planet angle in that as well. There's a good Daily Planet tale in that.
Absolutely. Well, Zach, thank you very much for joining me for this. And this was, you and I have been tweeting at each other and exchanging Twitter DMs for a long time now, but this is the first time we actually were face-to-face virtually and spoke. So it was great to have this conversation. I thank you for all your support. I hope everyone will check out dailyplanetdc.com and dailyplanetdc on Twitter. Yep.
Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, basically anywhere where you have a higher presence. I've reserved that on most social medias, but I only tweet and post on Facebook and Instagram. But yeah, at Daily Planet DC. I'd like to say we let everybody contribute. If you have an op-ed or something you want to write, or even a podcast, we'd be happy to share it.
There you go. Well, hopefully people will take you up on that. So thank you, Zach. Thank you, audience, as always. I always appreciate you tuning in. It means a lot. We will be back next week with an all-new episode. Until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. The spin-off podcast, Digging for Justice, a DC fan journey, is available now exclusively at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato, starting at the $1 level. New episodes release monthly, and many more rewards are available too, including a robust back catalog of bonus podcasts. Thank you to all patrons for enabling me to produce this show.